Every neighborhood has one. That single resident who believes the community was built for them and them alone, the kind of person who sees themselves as judge, jury, and executioner of suburban law. In our neighborhood, that person was Karen. She wasn't just an HOA board member, she was the self-proclaimed queen of the cul-de-sac. If you so much as parked your car 2 inches past the sidewalk, she'd file a complaint. If your grass grew higher than 3 inches, expect a fine in your mailbox. And if you dared host a barbecue that lasted past 9 p.m., she'd appear like a shadow in the night, phone in hand, calling the cops for a noise disturbance. But Karen had one fatal flaw: her obsession with power blinded her to boundaries. She didn't just enforce HOA rules, she invented them. She'd march around the neighborhood in her oversized sun hat and reflective vest, clipboard tucked under her arm like some sheriff surveying her land. Neighbors whispered about her, laughed behind closed doors, but most of us tolerated her antics because she was a nuisance, not a threat. At least, that's what we thought. For my wife and me, moving into the neighborhood was supposed to be a dream come true. A charming home with a wraparound porch, a quiet street for evening walks, and enough yard space for our golden retriever to run free. We paid our HOA dues on time, kept the lawn manicured, and followed the rules to the letter. But to Karen, our very existence seemed to offend her. Maybe it was because we didn't cower like the others. Maybe it was because my wife had once challenged her during a meeting, calmly pointing out that Karen's new parking rule wasn't actually in the bylaws. Whatever it was, Karen had marked us. At first, it was petty harassment, anonymous notes taped to our door, fines for supposed violations that didn't exist, and late-night knocks from HOA representatives sent at her command. But it escalated quickly. Karen thrived on intimidation, and when intimidation didn't work, she grew reckless. The more resistance she met, the more aggressive she became. One summer evening, while I was at work, my wife sat on the porch sipping iced tea, enjoying the breeze. That's when Karen stormed over, fuming, clipboard in hand. What followed would ignite a firestorm none of us could have predicted. Because that was the night Karen put her hands on my wife, and it was the night the entire world of our neighborhood turned upside down. It was around 7:30 p.m., just as the sun was dipping below the trees, when the unthinkable happened. My wife later told me she saw Karen striding across the lawn with her usual self-importance, her voice already raised in complaint before she even reached the steps. The issue this time? A seasonal wreath on our front door that Karen claimed was unapproved decor. But the HOA rule said nothing about wreaths. It was another fabricated violation, another attempt to assert dominance. What happened next was so fast, so shocking, that even the neighbors who witnessed it couldn't believe it. As my wife stood to defend herself, Karen shoved her with both hands. My wife stumbled backward, her iced tea glass crashing to the ground as she fell down the porch stairs. She landed hard, her ankle twisted, her arms scraped raw against the concrete. Gasps erupted from across the street. A couple walking their dog ran toward our house, phones already out to call 911. Other neighbors stood frozen on their lawns, disbelief etched across their faces. Karen, instead of apologizing, instead of helping, simply stood there with a smug expression, as if she'd just proven a point. But what Karen didn't realize was that she had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. This wasn't a fine, or a nasty note, or even a screaming match at a board meeting. This was assault. And when you assault the wrong person, there are consequences that stretch far beyond HOA politics. Because what Karen didn't know was that my wife wasn't just any ordinary resident. Before we'd moved into the neighborhood, she had spent years serving overseas. She had ties, deep ties, to people who didn't take kindly to someone hurting one of their own. And while she never bragged about it, while she never used her service as a weapon in neighborhood disputes, her name still carried weight in certain circles. So when the neighbors called 911, and word of the assault reached the right ears, the response that came wasn't just local police. It was something far larger, far louder, and far more shocking than anyone could have predicted. It started with a low rumble. At first, the neighbors thought it was thunder, rolling in earlier than expected. But the sound grew louder, sharper, a mechanical roar that shook windows and rattled porch railings. Within minutes, the source of the sound revealed itself: massive military convoys, one after another, thundering down the quiet suburban street. 5 in total. 5 convoys packed with uniformed personnel, their vehicles marked with insignias that left no doubt of their authority. Engines idled, radios crackled, and the entire neighborhood stood in stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. Children peeked from behind curtains, dogs barked nervously, and even Karen's smug expression faltered. The convoys stopped directly in front of our house. Soldiers disembarked with precision, their boots hitting the pavement in unison. This wasn't chaos, it was order, the kind of order that only comes from years of training and discipline. And at the center of it all was my wife, still sitting on the porch steps with neighbors tending to her injuries. When the commanding officer approached, it was clear he knew her. The respect in his posture, the urgency in his tone, the way his men immediately formed a protective perimeter around her, it was undeniable. My wife wasn't just another citizen. She was family to them. Karen, on the other hand, found herself on the wrong side of history. As she sputtered excuses and tried to play the victim, soldiers turned their eyes toward her with cold indifference. To them, she wasn't an authority figure, not even a nuisance. She was a threat who had harmed someone they respected. And threats are dealt with swiftly. The neighbors, who had lived under Karen's rule for years, couldn't believe what they were seeing. The HOA president reduced to a trembling figure as military personnel documented every word, every action, every lie she tried to spin. Her clipboard, once a symbol of her control, looked laughable compared to the steel resolve of those who now stood against her. And the truth was only beginning to surface. The investigation that followed ripped the mask off everything Karen had built her reputation on. While the immediate assault on my wife was serious enough, the military presence drew attention to much more than a single act of violence. Officials dug into Karen's record, both as an HOA board member and as a resident. What they found was a pattern of corruption, falsified fines, misused funds, and years of harassment disguised as community protection. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet out of fear now spoke freely. They provided evidence of Karen's fabricated violations, her intimidation tactics, and even the way she'd bent the HOA's budget to cover her personal expenses. Each revelation stacked higher, a mountain of wrongdoing that painted her not as a protector of the neighborhood, but as its greatest threat. The HOA board dissolved under pressure, stripped of authority until a fair and transparent election could be held. For the first time in years, residents felt free. They hung decorations without fear, parked their cars without harassment, and hosted barbecues without worrying about surprise fines. As for Karen, her downfall was swift and merciless. Criminal charges followed for the assault on my wife, as well as fraud and embezzlement tied to her HOA misconduct. Her once feared clipboard was replaced by handcuffs, and her reign of terror ended in the back of a police car. But the true legacy of that night wasn't just Karen's defeat, it was the reminder of what community really means. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now looked out for one another. The military convoys eventually left, but the image of their arrival remained burned into our memories, 5 powerful reminders that justice can come swiftly, and that no Karen, no matter how loud or entitled, is above it. In the end, the porch where my wife once fell became a symbol of resilience. A place where fear was replaced with courage, where silence gave way to unity, and where an entire neighborhood finally found its voice. And Karen? She became nothing more than a cautionary tale, an HOA tyrant whose downfall was sealed the moment she crossed the line from nuisance to criminal. Because when you push too far, when you abuse your power, and when you forget that even the quietest among us may have strength you cannot see, sometimes, just sometimes, 5 military convoys show up to remind you exactly where you stand.